What's up, you guys? Come on in. We got another episode of Jimmy Rants in store for you today. And just a reminder, if you hadn't heard of Jimmy Rants before, this is the show I originate on Instagram Live. If you want to follow me on Instagram Live, go to @LivinLowCarbMan as the username over on Instagram. And we'd be happy to have you because we have a lot of fun here on Instagram, don't we? We have all kinds of interactions with people. And they get to comment on what I talk about here, ask questions, blah, blah, blah. So thank you guys for being here. JimmyRants.com is the website if you're interested in seeing any of the past episodes. I think we have like 350 or so episodes over at JimmyRants.com. So if you've missed the show, come on in. The water's warm. We'd love to have you. We also post all of them over on YouTube. So type in a keyword search Jimmy Rants. You'll find the show over on YouTube. And yeah, we have a good time. We talk about health headlines. A lot of things are just on my mind. And so if I'm thinking about it or if it's interesting to me, I bring it to you here on Jimmy Rants. So today's Jimmy Rants, as you can see from the pinned post, is all about another one of these stories that's telling us that the red meat that we're consuming in our diet is somehow not good enough and that it needs to be replaced with some kind of a plant-based protein, and the purpose in that is for your heart health. So before I read the story, I want to give you some context. We have looked at cardiovascular disease, and we have found that a lot of the research has shown things that run totally counter to what our culture tells us is true. We've been told that eating red meat clogs your arteries and gives you heart disease, right? You go talk to any doctor, they're going to say that. We have been told that saturated fat is the great enemy in your health, especially your heart health, because it raises the bad LDL cholesterol and it gives you problems in your health that leads to cardiovascular disease, which is a heart attack or CVD or some other coronary event. And so when you've been led to believe that somehow, some way red meat is the problem, then of course, anytime you hear about alternatives to red meat to help better your heart, you're going to be more susceptible to receiving that. But can I be honest with you? There is no randomized controlled clinical trial that shows any harm at all comes to your heart from eating saturated fat. No harm at all to your cardiovascular system if you consume red meat. Luann will tell you, she's a good friend of mine, she sees me eating ribeye steaks almost every day. Pretty much the subsistence of what I eat. And so that's all I eat is red meat that's fatty and has lots of saturated fat. And I have a 0 heart scan score, 0 heart calcium score, which means there's no calcified plaque whatsoever, which means there's no heart disease developing. Even though in my family, I have a family history of heart disease, pretty much all the males got it. Well, why didn't Jimmy Moore get it? You know, what have I done that's different than them? All of them ate crappy garbage. And so while that might have been a genetic predisposition for it, I have bucked that because I don't eat that way anymore. I now eat mostly red meat. And so we have a lot of mistaken notions about what is at the root of heart disease. We also forget that when you eat red meat and saturated fat that comes with it, something very good on your cholesterol panel happens. Very good. When you combine it with a carbohydrate restricted intake, a ketogenic style diet, there are 2 numbers on your cholesterol panel that get radically better. One is your HDL cholesterol, which has always been considered the good cholesterol. So HDL invariably goes up, which is a protective measure in your heart health. Always goes up when you eat more saturated fat. When you restrict the carbohydrates and you eat that fat and protein, very minimal carbohydrates, you almost always see your triglycerides go down. So it's this triglyceride to HDL ratio that is the true sign of heart health. Now, what you're going to find out with these studies I'm going to share with you here today is they're not looking at those things. They don't give a rip about those things. They're looking at LDL and total cholesterol, which, quite frankly, the 1980s have called, and they want their diet advice back. They want their heart health advice back, because we haven't believed total and LDL cholesterol mattered since the 1980s. Since then, we've had so many advancements understanding triglyceride to HDL ratio, which came in the 90s. We've known about triglyceride to HDL ratio being a much better indicator of your heart health than LDL and total cholesterol. In recent years, we've had these LDL particle size breakdowns using like various technologies like the VAP test, the NMR lipoprofile test. These things show you, but still it goes back to, if your triglyceride to HDL ratio is under 1, you've got spectacular heart health. And when you eat a ketogenic diet, your triglycerides generally go under 100, well below 100. Your HDL goes over 50, well over 50. And it's that ratio between those two numbers that shows you have robust heart health. So let's juxtapose all of that context I just set up for you with what these two new preliminary findings of studies found. So the findings from two preliminary studies were presented at the American Heart Association's Epidemiology and Prevention Lifestyle and Cardiometabolic Health Scientific Sessions 2020. They suggest that if you eat less red meat and then you choose protein from plant and dairy sources, that could improve your heart health and lower your risk of death. Okay, I love the sensationalism that goes along with talking about this, because they pretend like you have a great risk of death if you eat red meat. I would argue that the people who eat red meat and are able to limit carbohydrate consumption in the midst of that, you're going to be far less likely to die of a cardiovascular type of event than probably anybody else, because we know the key reason why people develop cardiovascular disease is not fat, it's carbohydrate. You know what carbohydrate does in your body that would make you more susceptible to heart disease? It raises the blood fat triglycerides. And when triglycerides go up, your body has to deal with it, because high triglycerides is a highly inflammatory process in your body. So when you have high triglycerides, the body's doing its best to deal with the inflammation, and so it starts to send cholesterol, which is the purpose of cholesterol in your body, to those areas that are being damaged by those high triglycerides. Usually high triglycerides is also accompanied by high blood sugar, high blood insulin levels, thus causing further damage. So to think that red meat makes it worse risk for death is just ludicrous. It's so funny, a lot of times they do red meat studies and you look at the foods that they ate and they give them a traditional hamburger, which has a bun and a ketchup and all the things. But it was the red meat that did it. But never mind, there were confounding variables because they had the bun as well. And the French fries that went along with it. Oh, those don't have any impact. But red meat, yeah, it's the red meat. So let's see what these studies were about. There were two of them. If you just joined us, we're going to talk about two preliminary studies. The findings from them were presented at the AHA, one of their conferences recently, and they found that eating less red meat, more protein from plants and dairy sources could improve your heart health and lower your risk of death. So the first study, it happened at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And this is key, guys. Listen to this. They looked at more than 37,000 Americans, average age of 50. Okay, I'm going to give you a little primer on studies. When you read a study that has that many people in it, 37,000 people, people assume it's a study and that they must have individually looked at all 37,000 people. Can I tell you a little secret? Nope. Nope. This is what's called epidemiology. And in fact, this conference was the American Heart Association's Epidemiology and Prevention Conference. They're only looking at epidemiology. So what does that mean? It means there's already studies that have been done, and they take a whole bunch of studies that all looked at the same-ish thing, and they smoosh them all together, and they try to make sense of and new conclusions from looking at these as a collaboration. So epidemiology is probably one of the worst kinds of research that you can possibly do within the realm of nutrition, because epidemiology doesn't really tell you a whole lot. Epidemiology gives you theories that you can test in a randomized controlled clinical trial, but they're not telling you anything of significance to you as an individual, because most of it is based on trends and speculation and not on hard data. But let's see what they found. After estimating the amount of plant protein compared to animal protein in their diets, how'd they do that? How do you estimate it? Most of these studies, they do surveys. How many people in these studies that do like diet surveys, how many of them lie? Because they tell the researcher what they want to hear. Oh yeah, I cut red meat. I do more plant-based protein. No, you don't. Let's don't muddy this. No, you don't. So that's one mistake I'm looking at. They compared their risk of dying. The researchers found that those who ate the most plant-based proteins were 27% less likely to die of any cause, 29% less likely to die of coronary heart disease compared to those who ate the least amount of plant protein. Okay. A reason why this is a little off kilter, there's so many confounding variables here, but we pretend like all the plant protein people did was eat plant protein. All the red meat people did was just eat red meat. We know that's not true. People eat mixed diets. Most of the world's population eats a mixed diet. So you don't just eat red meat. You eat red meat with a bunch of crap. You don't just eat plant protein. You eat plant protein and a whole bunch of other foods. So how do you isolate what the causal factor was in this? This is the problem with epidemiology. 37,000 Americans sounds like it's a big number, sounds like it's very significant, when it's insignificant at the end of the day. Doesn't really apply. They also found that if participants replaced 5% of their daily calories from animal protein with the same number of calories from plant protein, that they could lower their risk of dying of any cause, including dying from coronary heart disease, by nearly 50%. Okay. How do they quantify that when they say lower the risk by 50%? What if the risk is like very, 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 very minuscule, and it usually is in these studies? 0.25% of 1%. So 1/4%. And then switching from animal-based to plant-based proteins lowers that 1/4 risk. It lowers it down to 1/8 risk. Was that a significant change? No. That's called the actual change. Okay? What they're looking at here, lower it by 50%, it's the relative change. So going from 1/4 to 1/8 is a relative change of 50%. But all they changed was 1/4% of 1%. Meaning over 99% of the population, nothing. No problems whatsoever with what they're doing. And yet they're trying to conflate it with this epidemiology and make it look like it's a bigger issue than it really is. I'll tell you who was notorious for this was the statin drug companies. For the longest time, Lipitor on television commercials said, "We can lower your risk of having a heart attack by 40%. You know what the actual change was? It went from 3% to 2%. So in other words, you're going to get a heart attack. It's like a 3% chance. You take Lipitor and it lowers it from 3% to 2%. That ended up being the 40%. You see how they play the game of relative risk versus actual risk? Brings it all into focus, doesn't it? They added that if you replace just 2% of your daily calories from processed meats, protein with an equivalent number of calories from plant protein, that was associated with a 32% lower risk of death. So again, they're playing a numbers game. And they know that most people seeing these percentages, oh wow, that's amazing, that's a really big change, when they don't realize the actual change is so minuscule, it's actually statistically insignificant. And yet they make a big deal about it. So that was the first study, you guys. Grab some water. In the second study, same School of Public Health, the Harvard School of Public Health. This time, researchers followed 43,259 males. Once again, they did not have all of those guys in a laboratory. They looked at data, not people. They looked at data. They followed them for up to 26 years. And they found that swapping 1 serving per day of red meat or processed red meat with plant foods such as nuts, legumes, whole grains, or with dairy associated with 47% lower risk of having coronary heart disease. Let me key in on one word in that sentence. Associated. Associated does not mean cause. Okay? Associated means there are likelihoods that it could possibly be linked to because we're seeing commonalities of, but associated does not mean caused. And yet they put it out there as if it's a cause. And they make these crazy headlines. Swapping out red meat for plant protein and dairy could improve your heart health. They didn't find that at all. The proper headline should have said, epidemiology study contends that if you swap out red meat for plant protein and dairy, that it possibly could improve your heart health, parenthetical, but not really. That would have been a truth in advertising headline. But you don't get a sexy blast in the health media by being wishy-washy. In addition, replacing 1 serving of any type of red meat each day with an equivalent amount of nuts and without upping the calories was linked to a 17% lower risk of dying of a heart attack, while replacing 1 serving of red meat with whole grains resulted in a 48% lower risk of dying of a heart attack. Something they're not telling people about this study. It's all well and good to make these associations and assume that they mean something within the world of epidemiology. What they don't want you to know is what they're asking you to replace the meat with isn't necessarily good for you, isn't necessarily giving you benefit in your health. Nuts. Now, I'm a big fan of nuts. I think if you're going to have some nuts, have like almonds and have nutrient-dense walnuts. Nutrient density is what you're looking for. The problem with nuts is a lot of them are roasted in really bad oils, and so you're getting more than just the nut. You're also getting bad seed oils, which make you more susceptible to heart disease. So if you replace it with, dry roasted or raw, then that's fine. But if you cook them in soybean oil, cottonseed oil, which a lot of them are, then you're going to run into problems because you get the nuts, yes, but it's offset because you got these bad rancid seed oils in there that aren't doing you any good. As for replacing red meat with whole grains, guys, let's be honest, whole grains is a joke. They pretend like that all those foods that are in stores that help made with healthy whole grains, almost all of those grains are not whole. They're very processed. Now, maybe what they're saying is before they processed them, they were whole, but they end up being processed. And so the body responds incredibly differently to processed grains. And I don't see how they think that that's a better idea than red meat. Replacing red meat with whole grains is crazy. It's like turning in your Lamborghini for a Yugo. You're crazy if you do that. I don't know about you, but I want to drive the Lamborghini. We'll keep the Yugo for the people who think the world is ending because the planet's on fire or whatever, right? On average, Americans eat approximately 3.5 servings of red meat each week, and about 1/3 have red meat daily. Our findings suggest that even partial replacement of red meat with healthy plant-based sources of protein could substantially reduce the rates of coronary heart disease in the United States, according to the lead study author of the second study, Layla Al-Shar, PhD. Layla, no, that is not what your study found. What your study found was that you found an association that you think matters, and therefore you're coming to a conclusion that's a preconceived notion of what you already believe, that somehow red meat is bad and that you need to replace it with a plant-based version of protein. So don't try to bamboozle people into believing that your study says anything of the sort of what you described here. It clearly does not. Okay? Are you guys getting the feel of how these studies can be used to manipulate the population into believing science shows something that it doesn't? If you watch that stupid Game Changers movie on Netflix, all about all the benefits of going plant-based and veganism, almost all the studies that they cited in that film were epidemiology. Epidemiology. So if they want to show that there's a bad benefit or a bad reaction to eating red meat, they got an epidemiological study that'll show it. If they want to show that eating more plant-based foods is going to be more healthy for you, they have an epidemiological study to show it. Epidemiology means absolutely nothing when it comes to you as an individual person. Randomized controlled clinical trials is the gold standard. That's what you want. The problem is most studies don't do RCTs. Most studies do epidemiology, they'll do animal-based models, so rat studies, and they don't really tell you anything. The only ones that matter are the randomized controlled clinical trials. The problem with that is most of them don't do it because they're highly expensive. I remember Gary Taubes was sounding the alarm when he wrote Good Calories, Bad Calories that we need an actual metabolic ward type of nutritional health study to prove the efficacy of a ketogenic diet. He said, but it would start the budget for a study like that. It would have to start at $100 million. Now, who's going to shell out $100 million to put a bunch of people in a metabolic ward for a year to watch them and to make sure that they're eating exactly what they're supposed to eat? Most, no. So they turned to epidemiology. And I remember hearing one of the vegan advocates, a very famous one, Dr. Joel Kahn. He was on the Joe Rogan podcast arguing or debating with Chris Kresser, I believe it was. And they talked about like studies, and Chris was over there citing all kinds of randomized controlled clinical trials. Meanwhile, Joel Kahn was talking about epidemiology. And at one point, Chris Kresser said, well, you can't keep citing epidemiology as if it matters. And Joel Kahn, in a moment of honesty, said something along the lines of, well, it's all we have. Well, no kidding. If it's all you have, you're going to cite it. I guess you can fool some people into that. But those of us who've been awakened to what really matters, you're not believing epidemiology anymore. Just like these 2 Harvard studies that claim switching red meat for plant protein will improve your heart health. It's epidemiology. It doesn't mean anything. Let me just pull it out of my keister. Here you go. That's what I believe. It would be just as important as the epidemiology is, which is not at all. It isn't enough just to avoid red meat. It's also about what you choose to eat in place of the red meat, said the lead author of the first study, Zhili Shan. Healthy plant proteins like nuts, legumes, and whole grains contain more than just protein. They include other beneficial nutrients like healthy fats, antioxidant vitamins, minerals, phytochemicals, compounds from plants, which have been associated with lower risk of chronic diseases like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and some cancer. Well, that's all well and good, Dr. Sean, but the problem is we pretend like there's no nutrients in red meat. And I've talked about this before on Jimmy Rants, and I'll continue to talk about it. Red meat is not just a blob of dead flesh. That's what the vegans want you to think. They want you to believe that all you're doing when you're eating red meat is just eating a dead flesh animal. Okay? Red meat and meat in general and eggs and fish and you can throw all the kind of animal foods in there. They contain, and they're the only food groups in the entire food group that you eat, they're the only food group that has complete proteins. No mention of that in this comment that they just mentioned. No mention. Red meat and animal foods are the only place you get complete proteins. So if you switch out for plant proteins, you're not going to get them. Now, they eat the dairy, they've got complete proteins in there, but most vegans don't call for dairy. They might eat eggs, some vegetarians eat eggs, some vegetarians eat fish, but most of them totally avoid all those, and so they don't ever get the complete proteins and all the problems with that. But red meat has so many micronutrients in it, and they don't acknowledge that here. They pretend like it's just the plant proteins that contain all these minerals and vitamins and fats. To me, the fats that are in plant proteins, and they brag about this, you guys, are the monounsaturated and the polyunsaturated fats. They're not acknowledging that saturated fat does a good thing in your body. So many good things in your body. And if you devoid your body of having any saturated fat, which from a plant-based perspective, the primary way you can get saturated fat from a plant-based perspective is coconut. Coconut is 90% saturated fat, coconut oil. And so that's about it. Everything else is monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats. And those are important to get. But you get all those in red meat as well, and they don't acknowledge that here. So guys, that's the two studies. These are preliminary findings, which means they're still doing the research, but they're putting it out there and making this claim that red meat needs to be eliminated, replaced by plant proteins. And quite frankly, I'm over it. Like, I'm over this idea that those of us who choose to eat red meat in our diet are somehow causing greater harm to our health than we know. And the God, honest truth is, it's a lie. It's a lie to pretend like eating plant-based proteins, which is what this fake meat, the plant-based burger movement is all about. Let's replace the plant or the red meat with the plant-based meat, and it's just as good. Da, 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 da. Which I have a story to share with you guys. The guy that created, the CEO of the company Impossible Foods, who created the Impossible Burger, he let out a little secret recently about what his real intentions are with creating that. I have that story. It's coming up on Jimmy Rant, a future episode of Jimmy Rant, so stay tuned. But we've just gotten into a weird place, haven't we? Where we believe plant-based proteins are healthier than meat. Meat is not bad for you. We have to get that out of our heads. We have to stop pretending like meat is the enemy. I guarantee you, if you go back to hunter-gatherer days and you look at the primary foods that those guys ate, I guarantee you their major source of sustenance was red meat. And fatty red meat. In fact, I remember interviewing on the Living La Vida Low Carb show Sally Fallon Morell from the Weston A. Price Foundation, and she said point blank, yeah, back in traditional cultures, they would have an animal kill, and the first place they'd go is the brain of the animal. Why? Because that was where the most fat was. And they would eat up the brain, they'd go to the heart, they'd go to all the fatty parts of the animal, and then they would throw away the lean meats. How about that? And yet, what do we do in our modern society? Oh, you need to eat chicken breast because it's the lean meat, and you need to have that as your sustenance. No, you're going to be hungry. And they knew this instinctively long before we had all the research and data about essential fatty acids. Long before that, they just knew by instinct of human nature, when you kill an animal, you go for the fattiest parts first, because that's where the nutrition is. And so, Harvard, good try, but we're not buying your epidemiological studies. All right, let's see what you guys have to say. Welcome in, welcome in. We're going to go to Instagram Live first, and we'll come over to you guys here at Facebook Live. As always, go to jimmyrants.com for all the past episodes of this show. My food eats their food, says Lisa. Or Ilsa, sorry. Wow, yeah, that's true. Brittany says plant-based protein equals processed chemical shitstorm. Speaking as an ex-vegan, it really does. Like if you look at what's in those Beyond Meat burgers or Impossible burgers or other plant-based kind of alternatives, it is not just one ingredient. Like if you get a steak or hamburger, it's got one ingredient, beef. But you get an Impossible burger or Beyond Meat burger or some other plant protein source, You got a whole list of all these ingredients just to make it palatable to the human tongue. Kat says, I think they're just afraid they're going to run out of meat, like there is some protein too. Yes. Bidib says carbs cause heart disease. They do. Carbs raise your inflammation levels, which then makes the cholesterol build up where the inflammation's happening, usually in your coronary arteries. It's the carbs that's raising the inflammation, and then in response to the inflammation, cholesterol in the body, which one of its purposes is to help dampen inflammation, they go to the site of that inflammation. So when they cut you open and they find your arteries have stuff in it that's yellow, we think, oh my God, we ate saturated fat, therefore that clogged my arteries. And what they don't know is basic human biology. That's not how fat works. What that is cholesterol that had built up there trying to keep you from dying because you inflamed your body with all those carbohydrates you consumed. You see how they have manipulated people into believing a lie? Eating fat clogs your arteries when it's just the opposite. Eating fat makes you healthy, creates good, healthy cholesterol levels, which when you eat inflammatory foods and your body has to respond with an inflammation response, which means raising your cholesterol, having deposits where the inflammation is, that's what the purpose of the cholesterol is. That's why the cholesterol is there. It's like if my neighbor's house was on fire and there's no firefighter that comes, what would happen? The house would burn to the ground. Well, guess what? The fire is inflammation. The firefighter is the cholesterol. And so if the firefighter came out and put out the fire, we wouldn't say, oh my gosh, the cause of all fires is firefighters. Look at it. They're always at the scene when there's a fire. They must be the reason why the fire started. Now that's ludicrous, right? But think that through a little bit. Isn't that exactly what we do with cholesterol? Oh my gosh, we see cholesterol all up in the coronary arteries, and so therefore that's the reason it's all that cholesterol and fat building up, when we have no idea that that is so dead wrong, it's not even funny. No, the cholesterol is there because it's dealing with the inflammation that came from the carbs primarily and also the industrialized seed oils. Those are the things that are most important in why you develop heart disease. Keto San Antonio says, I really think I am actually experiencing oxalate dumping from years of buildup. No one talks about oxalates. Well, there are people that are talking about oxalates, maybe a little more they should. I'm blanking on her name, but Sally, somebody tell me that name, but I'm blanking. But she talks about oxalates quite a bit in her work. Kat says, maybe plant stuff doesn't sell that well lately. More and more woke people wiping out meat shelves. Yeah. Yeah, the plant-based meats kind of industry is flailing right now. Really bad. And couldn't have happened to a nicer group. Stay-at-home keto, French fries soaked in vegetable oil. Yep. That is what to do. Survey result studies are not accurate. They never are. That's the problem. But most of these diet surveys, they send you the diet survey and they say, tell us what you ate for the past 2 years. Now, I eat basically a carnivore diet, so I have 2 ribeyes in the morning most of the time, and that's pretty much what I eat the whole day. Sometimes I'll have some in the late afternoon. So I know what I've eaten the last 2 weeks. Most people have no idea the last 2 weeks what they've eaten. And even if they did, they probably wouldn't be 100% accurate. But then they say, well, have you eaten the last 2 years? Do you know what you had this time last year? Most people don't. And yet they have to fill out this survey. Oh, I had 4 steaks, and so they're gonna be inaccurate. So you're exactly right. Hafersi says it lowers my blood pressure to listen to you, aka someone who has common sense. Good. See, that's the thing. I think sometimes we get these headlines. That's one reason I come on Jimmy Rants with these. We get these headlines, and I'll get them from people, and they'll, oh, what do you say to this? I'm like, I say it's a whole bunch of bullfunky. It just doesn't mean anything. If it actually meant something, if they did a randomized control clinical trial and they looked at several hundred people and they came to this exact same conclusion, then I would pay more attention to it. But until those studies are done, don't come at me with your epidemiology. This doesn't tell me anything that deserves that kind of headline. All this tells me is, okay, that's your theory, go test it in a randomized control clinical trial, and they just don't do it. Heather says, so I don't think the problem is epidemiology. The problem is the reporting of epidemiological studies as conclusive research. Epidemiology has become the propagandist's ultimate tool. And that's the problem. It is the reporting. You're exactly right. Epidemiology is a great way to create theories to be tested in a randomized control clinical setting. What it does not do is what all these headlines do. And so you're right. The reporting of it makes it sound like, oh my gosh, we should swap out red meat for plant protein and dairy to improve my heart health. When we don't know that in humans. We know that it's a theory, but we don't know verifiably that's going to do anything for us. So thank you for the distinction, but I still hold that if we're going to do epidemiology and we make it into a media explosion like this, there needs to be more responsible journalism about how you report on this stuff. CA82164, what does the rest of their diet look like? Exactly. We have no idea what the totality of their diet is. All we know is they blame the red meat and it had red meat in it. That's all we know. That's all we know. Dr. Joel Kahn is being paid millions of dollars to recite all of his bullshit, Mike says. He is. Sadly. You don't want to be jaded that people have motivations of money, but they do. And if you're paid to be a shill, then there's a lot of people happy to be a shill. Brittany says, I really wish more people understood the difference in value in a randomized study versus epidemiology. Most people have no idea the difference and hear these clickbait titles on articles and believe them. Yeah, in my book, Keto Clarity, I've talked about this before. One of my favorite parts of the book that Dr. Eric Westman, my co-author on that, did was we told you how to read a research paper. So Dr. Westman has been published 150 plus times in a wide variety of journals over the years talking about ketogenic diets, doing a lot of really good studies on ketogenic diets. And so he knows a lot about methodology when it comes to research. So if you've got Keto Clarity, flip to the back of the book, and towards the back you'll see how to read research. If you don't have a copy, go get Keto Clarity. It's in Kindle, hardbound. Get the book because it shows you how to read research. It goes over what I'm talking about here today, where you don't really want to trust epidemiology. You want to look for those randomized trials. You want to read in stories like this one, how it sticks out like a sore thumb that this is bad research. So if you haven't read that part of my book, please go check it out. Mike says, look at the versus study or Virtus study that was done at White Oak Pastures versus the Virtus study that was done at Beyond Meat and compared the findings. Yeah, there's a lot of people doing these kind of comparison research. And so, yeah, we need to pay attention. Brittany says, what a beautiful explanation of what cholesterol's actual purpose is. This is why we love you. Thank you, Brittany. I do like making analogies like your house is burning, your neighbor's house is burning, and cholesterol and firefighters. It helps solidify people so we don't see this sensationalism of, oh my gosh, I see all that yellow stuff in your arteries of someone who had a heart attack. Oh, it's blocked and clogged. And people just assume it's from the fat when it's never been about the fat, ever. Lockwood says, what about those people who have familial hyperlipidemia? What are your thoughts? So if you have a genetic predisposition for having higher cholesterol, it's not a death sentence. You can express that differently. For those people, I have talked, and I wrote about this in Cholesterol Clarity. For those people who have that, maybe slightly lowering the dietary fat and saturated fat for those people who know they have that is a good idea. Carbohydrate restrictions, always a good idea. Maybe those people bump up protein just a little bit because you want to make sure that you're getting that proper balance. I would also look for this thing called ApoE, genotype. So if you've never run your ApoE genotype, you only have to run it one time, and you're looking for what your numbers are. So mine is a 3-3. 70% of the population is 3-3, completely safe, all is well. There are people who have a 2 in there, and there are people who have a 4 in there. The worst one to be is a 4-4 on your ApoE genotype. 4-4 people and familial hypocholesterolemia people, they're all the ones that we have to be concerned with, making sure that you're not putting your body at risk by doing things that might hurt you. So we talked about it in Cholesterol Clarity. I'll urge you to go pick up a copy of that. Again, that's available on Amazon or wherever books are sold. Caption KC, the company that makes Little Debbie's, announced a big expansion and hiring plan today. Besides addictive junk food, they also make vegan food. So sad they have that big a demand for products. Well, I was the king of Little Debbie snack cakes back in the day. I would go down to my grocery store down the road here called Bilo, and I would buy 10 for $10. I think they're still 10 for $10 all these years later, but 10 for $10 Little Debbie snack cakes, and I would eat 2 whole boxes of them at one time. Did it for years. But it's interesting that they're going in the vegan food market. But again, that's another junk food market. So you would expect a junk food company to go into the junk food market some more. Beth, thank you. I knew somebody would know the name of the lady who talks about oxalates. It's Sally Norton, Norton. I had her on the Living La Vida Low Carb show about 1.5 years ago, talking all about oxalates and its impact on your health. So go listen to that. Go to llvlc.com. Type in a keyword in the little search box under Living La Vida Low Carb Show, Norton. You should be able to find it pretty quick. All right, so that's all the questions my Instagrammers had. Let me pop over here to my Facebookers. I see you guys there. Thank you for being there, but I can't see your questions. So thanks for watching. All right, let's see what you guys have to say. I set my alarm for 11 and 5 o'clock, says Norma. Thank you for that. I'm glad you're here. Sharon says, I love a good ribeye. Who doesn't love a good ribeye? Like, ribeye is like life. Dan says relative risk versus absolute risk. So talking about the numbers, well, there's 32% chance. That's relative risk. The absolute risk is those small numbers we were talking about. The World Health Organization pulls the same BS when they talk about red meat and bacon. They do. And they're overrun with vegans running them. So I haven't listened to them for years. All right, guys. So the bottom line is you're going to see headlines. And as we always do here on Jimmy Rants, you can't believe the headlines always. The headline doesn't tell the story. The story tells the story. So if you have friends in your life, if you have family, oh, I saw this study that talked about replacing red meat with plant protein, you can ask for them to show you the news article. And when you look at the news article and you see a big number like 37,000 people, 43,500 people, when you see that, you can explain to them that this doesn't tell you anything. They didn't look at people. They looked at data. And I don't know about you, but I'm not data. I'm a person. I'm a real person living a real life, and I want to know what this means in the real world. And epidemiology isn't going to get you there, okay? All right, guys, as always, go to jimmyrants.com if you want to access all the past episodes that we have for you on this show, so thank you for that. You can also go to YouTube, type in a keyword search Jimmy Rants, you'll find the show. Thank you to all my YouTubers who are watching this on replay. I see you there. I read your comments too, so thank you for all of your support. And until next time, we'll see you then. All right, guys.